Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and last week I did a video kind of responding to In Deep Geek's video on why Gollum fell into the crack of doom. In this video, I want to talk about two other videos that In Deep Geek put out recently, which I thought were also really interesting, but had to do with a completely different topic. And that topic is some comments that George R.R. Martin made about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And In Deep Geek goes a totally different direction than I'm going to go. He basically takes these comments by Martin, which had to do with, like, what was Aragorn's tax policy going to be like, and what was he going to do with the orc population and whatever. And In Deep Geek goes and does the very nerdy thing of actually addressing these questions by looking at what Tolkien actually wrote and giving answers to those questions. I'll link to both of his videos in the description below. They're both really worth looking at, so go check those out. But for this video, what I want to do is talk about why George R.R. Martin's comments show that what he's engaged in with the Game of Thrones really isn't the same thing as what Tolkien is doing in The Lord of the Rings. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Before I get to the exact point, though, I do want to make one comment about In Deep Geek's video on the whole tax policy thing. In there, he says that Tolkien probably, I mean, not Tolkien, Aragorn probably wouldn't have had to make a lot of, tax policy at all because he probably got, revenue from lands and things like that. And to the extent that he might have needed any, it would have been to buy the mithril for the gate that had been destroyed at Minas Tirith and was rebuilt with mithril after the fact. The only nitpick I have here is that I think, if I remember correctly, the mithril was actually kind of gifted by the dwarves, and the dwarves kind of gifted their work in doing a lot of the other work that gets mentioned there, so it's not even clear that he would have to have taxed anybody for that. But with that nitpick, let's look at, well, and I should say, other than that, his videos are great. Really good detail, so do check them out. That's really just a nitpick, really nitpick. But, I'm a nerd too, so I got to do that. Now that the nitpick is out of the way, though, let's take a look at why George R.R. Martin's fantasy is different. So fundamentally here, Martin is looking at this idea of Tolkien kind of giving us a everybody lived happy ever after type of ending, which isn't strictly true, but I mean, it makes sense for the point Martin is making, which is, Aragorn's a good man, he becomes a king, so Gondor has a good king, and therefore Gondor is a good kingdom. Everything works out for Gondor because of that. And he's saying basically like, well, what does that mean? What's his tax policy look like? Did he go on a genocidal war against the orcs and kill all the orc babies in their orc cribs? And, absurd questions like that, it's like, why would you even go down that road? But the reason he goes down that road is because fundamentally his type of storytelling in the Game of Thrones is a different type of storytelling than what Tolkien is doing in the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien would categorize what he does as fairy tale. And he talks about, what he means by that in the essay on fairy stories. And I'll link to the videos that I've done on fairy stories essay / talk that he gave, where I kind of go into a lot more detail as to what he talks about in that essay. But for here, the point is, on fairy stories, Tolkien talks about how fairy stories do certain things, for us in terms of, what in their character as stories. And one of those is the consolation of the happy ending, and more specifically, in Tolkien's coined term, the eucatastrophe, which is the sudden joyous turn, usually, if not always, brought about by providence, which cannot really be expected to occur again. And this idea of, this thing that happens at the end of a story, or at least at the climax of the story, which in Frodo's case, of course, is the fact that even though he claims the ring, Gollum comes out of nowhere, takes it, and then saves the quest by, basically not committing suicide because it's not intentional, but getting himself killed, which is, interestingly enough, very connected to the last video I did on In Deep Geek's other video. But anyway, that's an idea of what Tolkien is talking about with the happy ending, and specifically the idea of the eucatastrophe. So Tolkien is looking at this in a very specific kind of way, where the point of the fairy story is to give us this consolation, and it's supposed to mirror, for Tolkien at least, the Christian idea of the ultimate happy ending. There's, a eucatastrophe in human history, which he says the eucatastrophe is the incarnation. Of course, that's not the end of the story, but you nevertheless do get a happy ending to the story in Christian theology. And of course, Tolkien was a Catholic. That's, he believed in that idea. So he's looking at it from that kind of a framework. He's not interested in the kinds of things like what the tax policy is, or what Aragorn's post taking on the crown actions are going to be as far as the orcs as much. I'm sure he wouldn't have not thought about that at all, because Tolkien thought about everything to death when it came to his own mythology. I mean, he wrote so much about tiny details. But the reason he's not going into that in the story is because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is not to talk about Aragorn's politics. We can kind of gather some ideas about what they might have been, and we also get some idea of what kind of king, politically speaking, Aragorn was from his actions as king, where he kind of sits as judge. We get information about Numenor in the Unfinished Tales and things like that that indicate that, the Numenorean system was one where there's like ancient laws that just get passed down, and the king can't really change those. So this idea that the king is not so much, a dictator or tyrant as kind of like the ultimate court of appeal almost, and who is the leader of the military and that sort of thing. We can get some ideas about these things from the way that his world is set up and from some of his writings. But the point is not to go in and, like get an idea of exactly every minor detail that Aragorn would make, decisions about. That's really not the point. Whereas George R.R. Martin, in some sense, seems to be much more interested in that, because his stories are less about fairy tale and more about just human foibles, in a sense. He's seems more interested in showing how humans really screw up their own story, uh, because that's kind of a lot of what happens in Game of Thrones. But I mean, we've got the ending of the series now with HBO, but we don't have the ending of his book series, so we really don't know how that's going to turn out. We don't know that there's going to be a happy ending. There's certainly no promise of one, given how it's gone so far. But at any rate, the point being, he is much more interested in the political machinations and all of that stuff that's going on, because, for whatever reason, he's just not telling a fairy tale. That's not fundamentally what Martin is doing, or at least doesn't seem to be. We may find out it is by the end of him writing his books, but at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's really what he's going for. Another point, though, is not even just related to the fairy tale element. Here we get this idea that Martin thinks that we want to know all these details, but do we really want to know the details? Quite apart from the idea that fairy tales aren't really focused on that sort of thing, do we want to know what the members of the Fellowship are doing every minute of every day? I mean, we get this one passage shortly after they leave Rivendell where obviously they've traveled for like weeks, but it's, condensed into like a page, roughly, because nothing interesting happens during that stage of the journey. They travel from Rivendell down roughly to the gates of Moria before anything interesting happens, other than them being wet, cold, and tired. So, it's kind of like asking about Aragorn's tax policy is almost equivalent to asking about who uses the toilet how much on the trip. It's like nobody wants to know that. It's not relevant. It's not important. And this is also kind of related to the fairy tale aspect too, because there is a sense in which the idea of everyone lives happily ever after, which, by the way, Tolkien brings up this idea in The Lord of the Rings, and I've done a video on that as well, which I will link to. There's this idea that, you kind of do the most emblematic elements in the story. A lot of fairy tales are very short. very pithy, they get a message across, and they're done. They don't go into a lot of detail. So the Cinderella story, you can tell the Cinderella story in a matter of 10 minutes, more or less, if you really wanted to, and still convey almost all there is to convey in the Cinderella story. Because the point of it is basically that there's a girl who is very pure, very moral, also very pretty, but down on her luck and being treated like trash by her stepfamily. But she gets the prince in the end, and nobody even knows anything about the prince except he's the prince and he's handsome, and that's kind of it. But the point there is that the handsomeness and the fact that he's a prince is the point of who he is, not because everybody should want to marry a handsome prince, because some handsome princes might turn out to be absolutely ghastly people, but because in our minds we tend to associate nobility and beauty and all of these different things with goodness. And again, this kind of goes back to the idea even of Tolkien's Catholicism or Christianity more broadly. There's this equation of beauty, truth, and goodness. I mean, all of these things are kind of considered, in a sense, the same, ultimately. Obviously, you can have beautiful people who are just ugly in their personality. But the point is, true beauty and true goodness and true, truth itself, obviously, all kind of go together, or they should in some sense. And that, again, is kind of what the fairy tale is getting at. And so Cinderella is, of course, a beautiful girl. Why would we want to follow an ugly girl who gets the prince? That's really kind of the point of the fairy tale, is to tell us that the beauty is reflective of her own inner beauty. And so there's this idea within fairy tales that this is how things go. Good people do good things. And that also is a very Christian idea, because there's a verse that talks about the idea that, from the treasury of the heart comes the actions or the words of the mouth. And it's, if you're a bad person, you're going to do bad things. If you're a good person, you're going to do good things. And so the outer beauty that we get in a lot of the princess fairy tales that Disney has made a movie about, just about every one of them, the idea there is that outer beauty is a reflection of their inner beauty, because that's just the way that the human mind tends to think about these things, and it works in a story setting. Obviously, there's times where you want to invert that, and that's where, of course, the Beauty and the Beast story comes in. The Beast outwardly is a really ugly person because inwardly he's an ugly person, but we subvert that when we find out that he can be redeemed and he can be made a good person again, and at the end his outward form reflects his inward form. So there's all these different elements that go into how little we care about tax policy from a fairy tale perspective, but there's also just the idea that, do we really want that level of detail? That's not the point. We don't want to know what Aragorn did as far as tax policy, assuming he did anything at all. We don't want to know every conversation that the Fellowship had between Rivendell and Moria. We don't, there's a lot of things they probably talked about that would be really boring. I mean, think about your day-to-day life. Would you want anybody reading a book about that? Would you want to read a book about your own life? It'd probably read like worse than a textbook, because a lot of it would just be so, let's be honest, a lot of what I do in a day is also just vapid, mindless, nothing. It's not interesting at all. I might be enjoying what I'm doing in a given moment in the day, but would I want to read a story about it? Nah, probably not. Most of us just, what we're doing on a day-to-day basis is not interesting. And for the same reason, Tolkien doesn't go into Aragorn's tax policy or what he does with the orcs. It does tell us that Aragorn wages wars, and you can, watch the In Deep Geek video to get an idea of exactly how much detail we have on that. But ultimately, the point here is, it's just boring. Like, we don't want that. The only reason you would want to know that is if it somehow actually has a bearing on the story. And how many ways can you make tax policy relevant to that? That just doesn't work. It makes so much more sense from a story perspective generally, and more specifically a fairy tale perspective, to say that Aragorn is a good man, he was a good king, and he ruled Gondor well and wisely. You know, that leaves it up to the reader to determine specifically what that looks like. You know, some people might think that that means he institutes a progressive income tax and redistributes wealth to the poor people. Some people might think it means something more like a classic free market. It doesn't matter. The reader can make that decision, and the story appeals to everyone. And that's the beauty of it. But you start getting into a whole bunch of nitty-gritty details, it starts to become totally irrelevant to the story, and especially this story. I mean, just imagine the fact that The Lord of the Rings is all about this quest to destroy this ring. Aragorn is kind of an ancillary element to that story. Do we really care anything about what happens to him other than that he's a good man who's a good king who ruled his kingdom well? That's really all we need to know. That's the point. Because after that stage, Aragorn is off stage, mostly, because he was only there insofar as he was part of the quest to destroy the ring and as a member of the, the War of the Ring more generally. That's why he's there. I don't really want to know what, say, Dayan and Brand were doing up in the north, because that's extra to the tale. It's not relevant. We learn a little bit about that in the appendices, but that's why they're in the appendices. That's the whole point. So, I'm kind of belaboring this, but I'm just trying to give examples of why we don't care what Aragorn's tax policy was. There's so many reasons not to care. But that's either Martin being unfairly critical, or it's showing that what Martin is doing is just fundamentally a different thing than what Tolkien is doing. Tolkien is telling a fairy tale. That's his goal. He likes myth, he likes fairy tales, he likes these kinds of broad, sweeping, very thematic ideas, whereas Martin, I'm not sure whether he's interested in those things or not, but certainly his critique would make you think that that's not really what he's looking at. He's thinking that Tolkien is somehow lacking by telling us nothing about these details. It's precisely these lack of details that make it a really good story. If you cast in all these details, it would not anymore be a good story. So, at any rate, before I belabor it too much more, that's my take on, Martin's comments. Again, do check out In Deep Geek's videos, because if you want actual solid answers to Martin's critiques, he's done a really good job of explaining exactly, what information we have and what they can lead us to conclude. So, really great stuff. Go check out his videos. And subscribe to his channel if you think he's got some cool stuff to say. He does. So, go do that. So that's my take on that whole George R.R. Martin comment, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like and share it around. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can subscribe to my channel here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.